Real time.
The video is great, but if you ever get a chance to go to a conference where Matz is speaking, wink, wink, and you will have. If you haven't followed what I'm saying, you're very, very lucky people. Matz is, you may have heard of him. He was in The Karate Kid, and you're not allowed to say stuff like that. It's not even physically close. He would have been 20, so you shouldn't laugh. Just encourage me. I've known Matz for half a decade. I've met him many occasions. He's a beautiful, beautiful human. Unfortunately, beautiful human doesn't fit into the Matz is nice, so we are nice. And if you go through all the variations and try to come up with a better word, you can't. So that's why it's Matz is nice, because we are nice, because it makes an awesome word. If he will be here tonight. If you get a chance to personally meet him, you should. He is a lovely human being, a beautiful spirit, and the fact that he built the language that you all use is just a tribute to the excellent life choices that you all make. Please put your hands together for Matz. Come for some love.
Dr. Nick, I love his insanity. But that makes me even more nervous. Every time I give a keynote like this, I feel very, very nervous just because you don't speak Japanese. But that's okay. I don't speak Catalan or no Spanish, so you don't speak Japanese, so let's compromise. Okay, today, this is the picture. This is the picture I took yesterday, day before yesterday, so this is beautiful. I couldn't get in just because the line was too long. I just gave up. I hate to wait in the line. Instead, I visit Casa Balio. I can't pronounce it right. Casa Balio. This is a great place. I enjoy that. Anyway, the Barcelona is a great city. This is my second visit. The first one is in 2009, I guess. We had Baruco here, and this was a great conference. So I'm very, very glad to visit here again. Today I'm going to talk about the changing your world. But first, I'm going to talk about me. Myself. So if you don't like my talk about me, so you can sleep now. Anyway, my real name is Yukihiro Matsumoto, or in Japanese pronunciation, Matsumoto Yukihiro. But it is quite different from the Western names. So I decided to coin the nickname as Matz. This is quite, we in Japanese culture, we don't call each other by first name. So only my close family call me by first name. So, someone called me Yukihiro in my first name. It shakes my body, It's against my culture. So I coined my nickname from my family name. Then, so you feel happy that you can call me by nickname, and I feel happy, and then I don't shake my body by calling by my first name. Anyway, at that time, I didn't know that the Matz is a kind of Western names, and we can see in German and Sweden, and there are very similar names like Matz or something like that. Okay, and New York, New York Yankees has the pitcher named Steven Matz. So one day I Googled my name, and I found somebody named Steven Matz, and I've heard he's a great pitcher. Anyway, I was born in Japan back in 1965. I'm pretty old, I guess, against my appearance. So Japanese tend to look younger. I'm a programmer. In 1980, I started programming by using this computer. This is a very teeny computer from the Sharp company in Japan. This is kind of a desktop calculator, and it has the keyboard, and it runs BASIC. But its BASIC is very, 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 very limited. BASIC. It has only 26 variables. You can name a variable by a single alphabet characters. So you have only 26 global variables. And it only stores 400 steps. It's almost 400 lines. So this is a pretty teeny computer. And my father bought it. And that it was so fun. It was pretty adorable computer. Okay, I program. So the computer follows my order. It's kind of like what can I say? It's kind of like a pet. So when I command my dog to sit down or something like that, he sit down if I train him. And the computer, I tell him what to do, he do that. And in my childhood, I had a small radio-controlled car. But it follows my control. But it didn't make any decision, any judgment, any conditional behavior. But the computer makes me feel some kind of intelligence in it, even this size of a small computer. So I feel it's so adorable. So that's my primary motivation. So I became a programmer back then. Then, soon after that, the BASIC was too poor, I found out. So I studied programming language. I had been interested in programming languages. First, I bought a book about the language named Pascal. And it was quite interesting and amazing. I learned a lot about the language, like structures and recursion and the user-defined function, which is very new idea from the poor young basic programmers. And I learned a lot. So I realized there are so many programming languages out there. So each programming language are different. And it's followed by the designer's intention or philosophy. So this language is good at this field. This language is different from that language. That made me very, very, very interested in the language themselves. So I became a language geek. So in that sense, from Pascal, reading through the Pascal book, I didn't have a Pascal compiler because in that time it was so expensive for the poor high school boy. So I read through the book. I learned the programming language through reading a book without any programming. So I'm a higher programming language and Logo, Lisp, Logo, Smalltalk, etc. after Pascal. And programming language, we tell computers how to work. And in programming language, and the computer don't understand human language, like English, Japanese, Catalan, Spanish. But we define artificial language to communicate with computers. So the programming language are medium to to communicate with computers. So by using programming language, artificial language, computers try to understand us. So like he tried to understand us, and the computers also tries to understand us. This is my dog. How adorable the computers and dogs are. I was interested in the communication, even though I'm not very good at communication. But I had been interested in communication. I was interested in the communication medium. So that made me a language geek. So then after that, I became an open source kind of evangelist. In 1988, while I was in the university, I met Emacs on Sun3 workstation, which has the Sun3 workstation back then has a few megs of memory. And it's shared by the 200 undergraduate students. So I tried Emacs, but I never used, just because it's prohibited. The Emacs consume too much memory. When 200 undergraduates use Emacs on the Sun3 workstation with a few megs of memory, it's crashed. So we undergraduates are prohibited to use Emacs. But we are free to download free software from the internet. So we are free to read the source code, of course. So I'll download the Emacs source code and investigate it instead of using Emacs. Emacs was my first Lisp interpreter. I learned a lot about the language implementation from Emacs. Embedding integers in pointers, back and sweep garbage collection, calling convention between Lisp and C, Lisp and the language and C. They're all all in Ruby pretty much influenced by Emacs implementation, at least originally. I didn't really understand how Lisp works. I was fascinated by Lisp object implemented by C. Then I got the Spark station, so I started to use Emacs. Emacs became part of me. If I didn't like anything in Emacs, I could change it, just because the Emacs are so configurable. Emacs made me realize anything can be changed by a programmer. This is the greatest lesson I learned from Emacs. It's total freedom. Yes, we programmers are free. Freedom is very, very important, especially for programmers. That made me an open source activist. That I tell anybody I met back then. So the power of free software. We didn't have the term open source back then. So the term open source was invented in 1997. 97. So back then we don't have the term open source, but I encourage others to use and pour power in open source software. So today, I don't have to pursue anybody to use the open source, just because everybody uses it now. But back then, the very few people are confident in the power of the free software. So then I became a language designer. In 1989, I designed my first programming language as an undergraduate thesis. Programming language medium, as I told you, they form our mind. So the programming language helps our brain to form our mind, form our ideas that gradually formed into code. So in a sense, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is right. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is that say the human thoughts are influenced by spoken language, human language. But the language influences human thought more than we think. So I believe more so in programming languages. So when I was a basic programmer, I had a hard time to understand the concept of the recursion, just because in basic, we don't have local variable, we don't have the function call, so it's quite difficult for me to understand the concept of the recursion. And but after reading Pascal, I spent 3 days thinking about the recursion. I don't understand this concept at all. Then, after 3 days, I got it. And then, in the mathematics class, I learned about the what do you call it? Definition by recursion, the function definition by recursion, like factorial. So, oh, this is recursion. So, the language Pascal helped me to understand the concept of recursion. The similar thing can happen every time. So, the studying object-oriented programming in C++ or Java is quite difficult for some people. But after studying Ruby, many people find enlightenment through learning Ruby to understand the concept of object-oriented programming. So the language you use can easily influence your thought. So designing language means the programmer's mind. So I design a language that program you. I brainwash you. To be Rubyist. Hello, Rubyist. Most of you think languages are given. Most of you languages are given. We have Java, we have PHP, we have Python, we have Ruby. This is given, designed by somebody. Yeah, me. And a given. But think about that. You can design your language. You can design your rule. Designing language is ultimate freedom. You can choose whatever you want to program your program. So that made me a language geek. That made me a language designer to get the freedom. So yeah, Ruby is a great language. Ruby is my favorite language. I'm the creator of Ruby. In 1993, I started developing Ruby. Just because in Japan, and in 1992, the bubble economy was crushed. So we have very, very heavy depression after that year. So my project was canceled due to the bad economy. I have no assigned job. But luckily, fortunately, I wasn't fired. I have no assigned job. I wasn't fired. I have my computer on my desktop in the office. I have time. I have plenty of spare time. So I started my pet project, Skunkworks, without telling my boss. So I used shells back then. I knew Perl. I knew Python back. I loved object-oriented programming. So I had been the object-oriented big fan of object-oriented programming for a long time back then. So I put together everything I loved that gradually turned out to be Ruby, object-oriented scripting language. Then I put it in the internet in 1995. After that, some said, object-oriented programming. We have the object-oriented programming named C++, which is very useful for implement very, very big and complex system. I agree with that. But then they said object-oriented programming was too much for scripting. Scripts are very tiny program, less than, say, 100 lines. Why do we need to be object-oriented? So the Ruby is too much for object-oriented programming language. What? Who cares? But so I love the object-oriented programming language. I love scripting. I script every day. So why can't we have an object-oriented in scripting language? So that's my basic motivation. And the many people complained about that back in 1995. But today, the Perl is object-oriented, Python is object-oriented, PHP is object-oriented, finally, and and Ruby is object-oriented, of course. Every major programming language in the 21st century is object-oriented, except for a few functional programming languages. So, I see in for 21st century object everywhere. So I love Ruby. Ruby is my favorite programming language, as I expected, just because Ruby is my child. As a parent, I love my child. I love my child. But unexpectedly, Ruby is loved by far more people than I expected. So when I put it in the internet, so I expected that maybe 100 people has shown interest in the programming language, and it will gradually disappear in say 3 years, 5 years. But that didn't happen. Dave Thomas found Ruby. He wrote a book on a language that some strange guy in Japan implemented. So. And many people had shown interest in the programming language, Asian programming language. And they formed conferences, like the Ruby conference in the States, Baruco in Europe, and we have the Ruby Kaigi in Japan, and we have RubyConf China, India, Australia, Argentina, Brazil, everywhere. So many people, far more than I expected, have shown love and interest in Ruby. That's quite amazing. So as a summary of Side A, I'm a programmer since I was 15. And I'm a language geek because language is very, very interesting. And it has very heavy influence on your mind, programmer's mind. And I became an open source evangelist just because I believe in the power of free software, the open source software, just because it gives us freedom. Now, for programmers, freedom is very, very, very important. And then I became a language designer to embody the ultimate freedom. Just because I can set the rule of the Ruby world, Ruby universe. I am omnipotent in a sense. I'm a creator of Ruby. I implemented the future common sense. Back in '95, the object-oriented programming is not within the common sense of scripting programming, the lightweight programming language. But nowadays it's common sense. It's common sense. We need object-oriented programming to be the popular language in 21st century. So the motivation has been love toward the programming and the programming language, and the technology and the freedom. This is most important. So I am a programmer just because I want to be free. So many people in the world, outside of the programming world, use computers. So virtually every house in an advanced country has computers. And everyone uses computers. But they use computers just to make a paper, read a mail, watch the video from YouTube, Google it, or copy and paste, copy and coin the university report from Wikipedia. But that's the task defined by others, the programmers, the software providers. But we programmers can do whatever we want. Just because we can program, we can order a computer to do anything. So it's a freedom. The freedom is the most biggest motivation of the programmers, I believe. Okay, side B, you. I'm going to talk about you. So who are you? Let me guess. Most of you guys program. Some not. But most of you are interested in the programming language named after the jewel, right? So what do you want as a programmer? What do you want as a developer? What kind of person do you want to be? This is a very important question. I don't want to hear the answer from each of you, but ask yourself, what kind of person do you want to be? Do you want to be happy? Yes? No? No. Yes. You need to answer by yourself. Define yourself. What kind of person are you? What do you love? What makes you happy? I recommend you freedom as a very basic of the principle you follow to define yourself. Freedom gives you power. Freedom means decision. The freedom I believe the freedom is equal to freedom to choose, freedom of choice. So choice means decision. Decision making is the source of the freedom. So be a decision maker. So decide what kind of person do you want to be. Be a designer. So making decision means designing. Decision is freedom. Freedom is power. Power is motivation after to be a good programmer, great programmer. The motivation gives you even more power. So be conscious you're a designer. So you're not really a programmer. So I don't know the other countries, but back in Japan, the term programmer for most of the people is very lower level student in the IT community. But I don't agree with it personally. But but me a programmer, like get a design paper, then turn them into the code, they don't make any decision. So they're not fun. They don't make decisions just following the order. It's kind of like a slaves. I don't like that kind of job as a programmer. So, but when I program, I can decide what kind of program I write, or what algorithm I can use, and what data structure I can choose. So, in writing software, in developing software, please be conscious you're not mere programmer, but a designer. So you are you, not a mere employee. So don't program for money only. Okay, we program for money, but don't program money only. Not a mere hired programmer, not a mere coder. You're a designer. So designer of your code, designer of your API, more importantly. The API is much more important than the mere code. just because it's an interface. Interface means communication. Communication between man and machine, communication between machines, and the more importantly, communication between us, humans. API is a communication. I told you I'm very much interested in communication just because I'm pretty interested in interface. Interface is very much important. So be conscious that you're a designer of your API, your interface, designer of your architecture, designer of your language, designer of yourself. You can spontaneously program. You don't have to wait for orders. You can define yourself. Are you enjoying your life? If yes, that's fine. But if not, step forward and make decision. Good. If not, bootstrap yourself. It's quite difficult to have, it's quite difficult to be a leader of the big open source software from scratch. But, back in '95, there are no such things as a Ruby community, just because, the Ruby users are one. Me, myself. But, I was pretty lucky. So I put it in the internet, and some people have shown interest and gathered together and gradually formed a community in the internet. And now we have very strong community around the Ruby and Rails, and maybe we have the millions of people using Ruby. So now you don't have to do your job, your task, your project from scratch. You can you can piggyback your project on Ruby or Ruby project. Okay, you can write gems. When you write gem, you can piggyback on the Ruby and Rails community. So it's much faster than starting from zero. So today is pretty good day to start new things using the Ruby community. And having your project, you can be a leader, and the Ruby community became more, rich. Use Ruby, use Rails, use JVM, use open source. They enhance them, they tweak them, fork them, make your life better, and create better tools, change your world, make others' life better, form the community. And the other reason today is a good day to start new things is social coding, like GitHub. I wear a GitHub t-shirt here. It's kind of semi-automated community. Before social coding happens, programmers write code for computers, and forking is bad, just because the forking wastes precious power. But so the benevolent dictator controls the community. But after social coding, programmers write code for other programmers. So you can easily fork and modify, then send pull requests. It's quite easy to be a contributor, so we have less control, and it's kind of like I'm not good at French. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Did I say right? It's kind of like a democracy. You don't have to be have to be born as a nobleman to be a contributor to open source. You don't have to be a colleague of the open source leaders. So you have to you don't have to be a friend of other open source leaders. So you just fork the project, to make an enhancement, just send pull request. It's quite easy to involve. It's quite a good day. And prove yourself by involving new project. So you can build up your trust from others in the open source community. So you can be a man or woman to be trusted, to have power over the community. So you have chance. You can change the world much easier than previous days by programming, by influence others, by leading community. You can change the world, as I did. Change the world, because you can. By changing your world first, because your world is part of the world. If you can change your world, you can influence the people around you, and the people around you gradually connected to the whole world. You can do that. You can change the world. You can be a leader of yourself, your project, your community. And good things. Come join us first. Bootstraps. Use us. Step on us. Work together. Educate yourself. Start your project. Influence the world. We can make the world better. Happy hacking. Not the end. Appendix. So this is pretty emotional presentation. So for you guys seeking technical topics, I prepare you some more technical topics. We had the Ruby 2.0 in last February in Ruby's 20th birthday. So in February 23rd, I started in February 23rd, 1993, I started programming Ruby, developing Ruby. So I defined the day as a birthday of the Ruby language. So the 20 years has passed since then. So we graduate the 20th birthday of the language. So we released Ruby 2.0 as a memory. And we have changed the versioning scheme after Ruby 2.0. So we have new release policy, which is the Ruby 2.1. We will release Ruby 2.1 on next Christmas, December this year. And after that, we basically release one release in a year. So we are going to have the Ruby 2.2 in 2014 and Ruby 2.3 in 2015. So in the Ruby 2.1 will be small enhancements. So it is basically compatible with Ruby 2.0. But we have added some interesting things in the language, like suffixes. So we add I suffix for complex numbers, like 1.0i as a complex imaginary one, and R suffix for rational numbers. So we have 0.1r as a rational 10 by 1. Reverse. I'm sorry. 1, comma 10. I made a mistake. F suffix for frozen strings, like a frozen F as a frozen strings. It's similar to frozen.freeze, but we don't generate the extra object. It does not allocate the extra string object. So, and the refinements. In Ruby 2.0, we introduced something named refinements, which is kind of like a scoped monkey patching. And we relax some kind of limitation. We put it in the Ruby 2.0. So in 2.1 now allows module scope using. So you can, in Ruby 2.0, the refinements are scoped by the files. So if you put the using, the refinements is effective throughout the file. But in this Ruby 2.1, so refinements can be scoped by modules. And we add a new method named string scrub to remove the invalid characters from strings. And now def and define method returns the symbols of the method it defined. This is the language change, and as internal, the biggest internal change is the Augen GC, which means the restricted generational garbage collector, which means restricted. As a design from the design whole of the C API of the C Ruby. So it is quite difficult to implement the generational garbage collector in C Ruby, just because we disclose the internal structure too much to the C extensions. So we cannot put the right barrier for the C extension. But the Koichi, who is in charge of the virtual machines, got a nifty idea, which is the restricted garbage collection. So in the plain mark sweep garbage collection, which we use, mark time is proportional to the number of living objects, and sweep time is proportional to the number of whole allocated objects dead or alive. So Augen JC does not change the sweep time, but it reduced the mark time to less than 50%, just because you don't have to scan the older generation. So we can only restrict it scans to a newer object, newer generation object. But the sum object, because the internal pointer is disclosed to the C extension, so some object cannot be protected by right barriers. So we mark these objects as a shady or doubtful object. So then treat these objects as a newer generation. So in that scheme, we can gradually move toward the generational garbage collection, and gradually reduce that kind of shady object. Right now, it makes out-of generation of the Ruby distribution to 50% faster. It's quite a number. So you can expect Ruby 2.1 in next Christmas, and it will be faster and more stable, and a few nifty language addition. So this is about the technical topics. So any questions? Probably it's out of time though. So if you have questions, catch me anywhere. I'm walking around the venue, so catch me and ask questions. And thank you and gracias.
All right, we have a question.
I have a question, yeah. Being a language geek, have you ever looked into Haskell? That's the question.
About Haskell?
Yes. Have you ever looked into Haskell?
I had to confess one thing. I'm very, 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 very bad at math. So it's quite difficult for me to understand the Haskell program more than 5 lines. But as an impression, Haskell is a great language, I believe. I'm not smart enough to write down the Haskell code more than 5 lines.
Forgot it.
What advice do you have for someone interested in implementing a language they've designed?
Implementing,
Implementing a language that they have designed.
you know, having more language is fascinating things, I believe. So I pretty encourage anybody to implement their own language. So you might not be succeeded to make it popular, but at least by designing language and implementing it will teach you very great things about computers and the programs. So design your language, and it will enlighten you, I bet.
What language you don't like at all?
Pardon?
What languages you don't like at all?
Oh,
What language do I?
You
What-
hate,
what-
you don't
no,
like.
programming language?
Yeah,
What programming
Oh, yes.
languages do you not like?
Yeah, I use, as a programmer, I use Ruby and C, and the ratio is maybe 60 to 70% C and 30% Ruby, just because the Ruby is implemented in C. So, and I work on the core. So, and a little bit of Emacs Lisp. This is the programming language I use often. And as a language geek, I love to study other programming languages like Haskell, Clojure, Scala, or anything. So I write down some small, teeny sample programs to ensure the behavior of the other languages. But I don't consider it as a programming.
Shortly before refinements was
Yep.
introduced, there was, to us outsiders, there seemed to be a bit of controversy among the various implementers of Ruby virtual machines.
Yep, yeah.
So by 2.0, refinements was introduced, and I think that it was officially called an experiment. Obviously, it's going to be in Ruby 2.1, and it's going to be part of the Ruby language. Have you? What's your take on the current status and current state of the various implementations and the support for refinements in other Ruby virtual machines other than MRI?
Yeah. So the concept of refinements born in, say, 10 years ago. I gave a presentation in RubyConf 2004 about something like refinements. We didn't made up that term refinements back then, but we make it whatever. Selector namespace or something like that. Then, so the concept was more than 10 years old, but it's quite difficult to implement it efficiently. But a few years ago, a guy in Japan was finally implemented the refinement. So it was quite acceptable in performance. So we merged it. But as you know, the very big discussion was held, just because that refinement behavior has two problems. The one problem is a performance. So it might slow down the programs that doesn't use refinement at all. So it's quite unacceptable. And it's quite difficult to implement a good way in, say, JVM, just because you cannot tweak JVM. So this in CRuby, we can do anything to make it. We have virtual machines by ourselves, but you can't change the JVM. So the performance problem is pretty significant in JVM, in original behavior. The second problem is the original behavior was the refinements are allowed in so many places, So that would easily lead to confusion. So these two things are the problem, especially the people behind the JRuby told us. And I agree with them. So we reduced the spec of the refinements in minimal in Ruby 2.0 to ensure that it won't hinder the performance in non-refinement programs. And it would run okay on the virtual machines. Then, so after using the refinements in Ruby 2.0, so we just relaxed the safety part. So it's the current behavior of the refinements in Ruby 2.1 is a little bit different from the original behavior to ensure to avoid these two problems.
Please put your hands together for Matz.
Thank you.